Hi everyone, I'm Kiva from ECC. I'm delighted to introduce Sally Isaacs, who is a legal director in the employment group of Eversheds Sutherlands. She has considerable experience of employment tribunal litigation and specialises in discrimination law, with particular emphasis on equal pay. Sally has been responsible for a number of high-profile equal pay cases over the last 15 years, including defending mass equal pay litigation. She's worked with clients on gender pay gap reporting and equal pay audits, often using Eversheds Sutherland's pay gap reporting software. Sally and ECC are running the ECC grading and pay event, looking at graded pay structure modelling in December. Unfortunately, this event is now fully booked, but we will rerun it in the new year, so keep an eye on our website for dates. If you can please use the question and answer function to send any questions throughout the session. There's also a chat available if you'd like to add any comments at any point. I'm going to hand over to Sally. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiva, and good afternoon, everybody, from a pretty cold South Wales, actually. What I'll do is I'll put the slides on the main screen so that you can actually follow me with the slides for most of the session. So I'll do that now. And hopefully that will work. There you go. Right, so what we're going to be looking at today is your action planning for pay gaps. And when I mention pay gaps, obviously at the moment we've only got the mandatory pay gap reporting in terms of gender, but you know, lots of organisations will already be looking at some of the other protected characteristics, and we'll come on to deal with ethnicity in a little while. But what I want to cover are the types of action plans that you may have currently in place or that you may be moving towards. And looking at those in a bit more detail, because it's always useful to know what other people are doing in terms of their action planning. Some barriers to effective development and implementation that some of my clients certainly seem to experience. We'll look at some of the content of those plans, their development, and importantly, the evolution of those plans. How you deal with publication, and also monitoring general progress and the evaluation of those plans moving forwards, because that's really the key to all of this. Isn't necessarily getting, you know, the action plan is important, but the most important part is actually making sure that you're following through on those actions. So we'll look at that as well. So covering first then, looking at action plans generally. In terms of reducing the gender pay gap, the non-statutory guidance, which many of you will be familiar with, this is the joint ACAS and the Government Equality Office guidance, refers to a number of kind of initial suggestions, and these are kind of high-level suggestions that are considered to be best practice. It's making sure, first off, you've got an evidence base in terms of evidencing your gender pay gap, so that can be your data internally. Obviously will form a part of that in terms of the analysis that you do in terms of what your gender pay gap is. There's also lots of other statistics you can use in terms of, you know, what's going on in the sector, what's going on geographically, and that's available. The ASHE that the ONS produces has some useful guidance and data there. They also recommend things like ensuring that your related policies and practices are up to date. And that can be anything from your pay practices to your recruitment practices, flexible working practices. I've mentioned flexible working again on that slide there. Training and supporting line managers in following through on those policies and practices in practice, because it's all very well to have them in place, but actually if it's not being proactively undertaken on the coalface, as it were, then it's not going to happen. How you look at career and talent development, that's a really important part, a key facet of all of this in terms of trying to take action to reduce that gap. Looking at potential negative impacts on pay systems. Most of you I know will have in place job evaluation through the HERA scheme and have quite transparent pay scales, but that may not necessarily cover all of your population of staff. I know, for example, some institutions I work with have particular issues with professorial pay, for example. So it's looking at what you do in that space and consider taking positive action. That's something that I'll come on to very briefly at the end as well. But it's the extent to which you do that, because as you'll all be familiar, positive action is something that you are able to take within certain parameters. Usually involves a specific group being disadvantaged because of their sex, that they are underrepresented in your workforce, and that there are specific needs to be met. Now, it can be slightly controversial in some circumstances because obviously there's no legal requirement for you to take a positive action, but it is permissible in certain circumstances, and it is something that I'm seeing more employers using. Having, they take legal advice in relation to whether it's appropriate in the circumstances they find themselves, but it is something I think for you all to watch out for in terms of taking action. So just want to touch briefly on the types of action plan you may have, or you may have an action plan and you're thinking of developing that or moving to a new form. I tend to see some standalone pay gap action plans, but they tend to be less common than an action plan which forms part of the wider gender pay gap report commentary. That seems to be the kind of main source of action plans that I see, anyway, forming the narrative section of gender pay gap reports. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that these vary tremendously from one-page sheets that just set out the basic statutory requirements in terms of reporting, compared to others that tend to contextualise what they do and the demographic of their workforce in terms of explaining the reasons for the gender pay gaps. That's more common in my experience, particularly in this sector, whilst others may, for example, use the wider strategic plan that they have in place for equality and diversity strategies generally, and that may be their action plan. So it really is a matter for you. The level of detail is important, because some action plans will be very detailed in terms of actions, others less so. We'll come on to this in the context of actually specifying the actions that you're going to take, because sometimes you need to try to make sure that they're achievable. And one of the most important points is the attribution of responsibilities, because it's all very well to have an action plan in place, but you need people to be driving it through to make sure that it's actually happening on the ground. One of the main issues that I see when I'm reviewing action plans as part of reviewing gender pay gap reports is the fact that people have put actions in place and they've not been followed through. And if I'm honest, that can sometimes be more of a hindrance and less helpful if in the event that you face litigation, for example, or if you've got issues within the workplace, then not having any actions in place at all, because it seems to suggest in certain circumstances maybe that you're paying lip service to those actions. So you do need to be careful about that level of detail and responsibility for what you're going to be undertaking. So in terms of your action plans and how you have effectively diagnosed maybe what you consider to be the cause of your pay gaps, have a think about how you analyse your information. Have you just asked for reports to be run, for example, in relation to what the statistics are that you have to report on, or actually are you looking at a wider data piece in terms of pulling this information together? And how do you cut your data? Do you look at matters on an organisational basis, or do you look at it more from a departmental, functional, geographical level, and compare that then to the overall workforce composition? I see different analysis being taken by different employers in that respect. So that's always a good place to have a look at when you're reviewing your gap. Obviously, you'll have other data that's available to you in terms of leavers and joiners. Flexible working indicators is an excellent source of whether some of your policies are working well as well. And one thing that we're seeing more of, and I mentioned this in the context of ethnicity pay, which we'll come on to shortly, but this is a concept that the US use a lot when they're looking at pay analysis, and it's something that's becoming much more common now in the UK as well, where you look at the impact of various factors on pay, so that you're not just looking at the actual statistics in terms of the gender pay gap. You may be looking at other factors in terms of age, in terms of geographical location. It's something that I think is becoming more common, and something that you might want to have a look at in the context of your action plans, and whether that's something that you think you should at least explore. There's, of course, then always external analysis that you can undertake through consultants, etc., just in terms of benchmarking where you are and looking at what others are doing. So I did mention ethnicity pay reporting, and it'd be remiss of me not to mention this, obviously, when it's likely to, as far as we know, it's likely to be something that comes into force early in 2022, but at the moment, as you'll appreciate with everything going on with COVID and Brexit, it hasn't yet been released in terms of how that's going to look. But the consultation's been closed a while now. It was back in January 2019. And as a firm, we launched with the CBI a Bridge the Gap guide, which some of you may be interested in February 2020, which is available online, suggesting reporting on a voluntary basis, just to try to get used to collating data to start with in terms of ethnicity pay gap reporting, because one thing that the BLM movement this year has done has heightened ethnicity pay reporting as a tool, effectively, to improve racial equality in the workplace, which can then be linked into your current action plans. And for those of you who are interested, we've actually developed a desktop audit tool, which lots of our clients are using to try to get ahead of this. It helps you understand what information you currently have as well on ethnicity, because it can be difficult to report on this. Well, it is difficult if you haven't got the raw data there to start with, and how you're going to move towards potentially collating that. So if anybody's interested in that, then just let me know in the chat box at the end. So in terms of the usual barriers to development, and not just development, actually the implementation, it's the same mold really. It's difficulties in relation to time pressures, available resource. Clearly, that's an issue when there are so many other pressures on your times and budgets at the moment. Management commitment and buy-in as well, that's critical, because you do need that available resource and time in order to make sure that these action plans are effective in practice. It's not something that you can just dip in and out of. And as I said, the number of times that I see clients frantically running around a couple of weeks before they're publishing their new action plans together with their gender pay gap narratives just before publication, it's not ideal by far. So it really is important to get that level of buy-in. Obviously, there can sometimes be a lack of awareness of the causes, and again, that goes back to how you cut your data and how well you know your organisation in terms of what's going on. And there can also, of course, be disagreements in relation to the strategy that you're adopting and the level of planning and general approach that you take for these matters. That's critical, having a clear strategy and having somebody who's going to be there to drive it through. And whether that's just in relation to gender or whether it's on the diversity piece more widely, making sure that you've got somebody who's going to be actually targeting that and responsible for it is critical. So in terms of developing action plans, this is quite a neat slide in terms of the steps that you need to go through. And you can see that it involves analysis and research, understanding the causes in your organisation and exploring options for closing the gap, drafting the actions or collating them from other documents, consultation and feedback, refinement then, before you finally sign off and the report is approved and published. Publication is something that we will come on to a little later, but just looking first at the analysis and research part. Understanding the cause of your gender pay gap or ethnicity pay gap or wherever it may be involves having a look and analysing actually the information that you have. That sounds easier than it is in practice, but you will have lots of sources available. So for those of you who've gone through Athena Swan accreditation documentation, you'll find that there'll be lots of information there that will be of use. The difficulty sometimes will be there's so much information is, exactly what do you extract from that? But that's somewhere that is a good place to start. It's funny, I had one client recently who'd been through Athena Swan accreditation a number of years ago now, who actually said they've been doing it for 10 years and they've been doing their regular audits they're under and the work that they needed, but actually they had no prompt as part of that to develop an effective gender pay gap action plan. So reporting actually had been a good prompt for them in that respect. Many of you will have done equal pay audits. I know I've done lots for the sector, and that's also included some other protected characteristics like disability and ethnicity too. That's a good source in terms of because obviously you can number crunch then in terms of micro level information. You'll obviously have, well, many of you will have your existing equality and diversity plans in place, and you can extract from that the information that will help influence your action plan. Or it may well be actually that you think, do you know what, we actually need to do a bit of a more nuclear approach to this, and maybe the way that we do that is to review everything and start from scratch using what we've already got to feed into a new action plan. And that's fine. That's the purpose of looking at what other people are doing. These are living and breathing documents, so it's important that you treat them as such and adapt them or start afresh if you think that that's actually the best thing that needs to be done. Problem is that takes time and resource, which is why that buy-in becomes really important. In terms of identifying then influences, lots of clients take different approaches to this. So for example, lots will look at guidance that's available online. I've mentioned the guidance obviously in terms of the gender pay gap from ACAS and the GEO, but there are also other sources out there. Academic reports lots of people like because it means that the information that you gather is grounded in evidence, which is helpful in terms of your action planning. One useful thing some clients also do is they adopt almost a life cycle approach to reviewing their current practices. And what I mean by that is that they look at the life cycle of the employment relationship, and what they find is that they will look at matters like recruitment, the induction process, conditions of employment, mentoring schemes, training, pay, the level of engagement they have over the organisation, and that can highlight steps that you could take and build into your action plans that may not necessarily have been considered as part of that overall first slide that I looked at regarding flexible working policies, etc. So all of that can help in terms of looking at the information that you gather. And then as part of actually that analysis stage, you're probably at the same time going to look at the degree of overlap with the actual writing of the plan, because they kind of go in tandem, to be perfectly frank. So you're probably going to be doing your action plan at the same time you're undertaking your analysis. But one thing I think is really important is making sure that you're setting realistic actions right at the start. So for example, if your action plan, if action point 1 is the action is going to be reducing the gender pay gap by 5% in the organisation, that's a pretty big statement to make. And it's a very difficult objective to achieve in practice because of the numerous factors that all feed into the causes of the gender pay gap, many of which are societal. So it would maybe be more useful to have that as an overall theme, but actually to have your actions slightly more in line with, say, SMART objectives, so that actually they're more attainable and more measured in terms of the ways that you can develop that. But one of the important points I think that you need to focus on here is who's going to take ownership of the plan and who is going to follow up on those actions, because you really need that. It can be a team, it can be one person, but it has to be somebody that's looking at it and making sure that it is being kind of taken forwards, because otherwise there's that danger, I guess, that it will fall between various people and won't actually get done, which, as I said, can sometimes be a worse position to be in than not having those clear defined actions in the first place. Athena Swan, again, it's something that lots of clients will use if they've gone through that accreditation process in terms of drafting up their action plans. Some feedback that I've had from some clients who've been through it is that on balance, the Athena Swan approach isn't necessarily, in their experience, a framework for developing specific gender pay gap action plans, but the principles obviously you get are important in terms of scrutinising policies and cultural change, which form the base of planning, because sometimes the level of detail is incredibly detailed and very resource intensive. It involves considerable data. So that's something you might just want to be alive to when you're considering the content of your action plans. So once you've obviously looked at what information you've got and you've drafted your action plans, you're then looking at the consultation and refinement stage before you get final sign off. This is really, really important because feedback on your initial drafts is really vital in terms of getting good engagement across the piece. And this can be linked to work that you're undertaking more generally regarding the public sector quality duty. But what I do see a lot and what is really helpful is getting drafts for consultation at all levels. So that's not just buy-in from HR, it means buy-in from your senior leadership teams, it means buy-in from your governors, working with your trade unions through your collective bargaining machinery to make sure that you've got buy-in there. I also see lots of clients now who are actually engaging externally in relation to this issue, and looking at kind of external stakeholders with whom they work quite closely in relation to what their action plans include, and sharing information externally as well with other people who are doing this work in other organisations can also be really helpful in terms of us all learning what works for that organisation. And I mentioned publication there. This needs to be thought about in terms of how you're going to go through this publication stage. Is it the case that actually you're going to make your whole action plan available to all staff for transparency or policy reasons? Lots of my clients do. They're completely open and transparent in relation to their full action plans, because very often they're all embedded in the gender pay gap report anyway. Or lots of other clients will do an abridged version because of the level of detail that they have in their plans, and they will publish that abridged version whilst keeping the more detailed, granular level of action planning internal to their team, because of the fact that it's changing constantly, it's changing often, and it's a living and breathing document, and that they feel that actually that's the better way for their organisation to work. Again, it very much depends on your own philosophy when it comes to this form of information and the various pressures that exist both internally and externally in that respect. And I know in Wales, for example, there are specific duties regarding the publication of action plans under the public sector quality duty that don't exist elsewhere, but it is something to think about. And many organisations will say, well, it may well be something that we'll publish in future once we've got a good handle on actually how the actions that we're putting in place working. So that's something to think about as well. Now, monitoring progress and evaluation is critical, and I think this is why it's really important actually to make sure that the action planning is targeted enough so that it links to the objectives, which is difficult in practice to achieve. It's difficult to be able to actually make sure that things happen in practice without it becoming something that somebody's taking ownership of on a regular basis. But I think we have to be realistic here in terms of progress, because of the fact that, as I've mentioned, the gender pay gap is complex and isn't something that will necessarily be resolved just by a set of action plans. One thing that really annoys me, if I'm honest, is when I see some media reports in relation to gender pay gap reports, because in the same sentence as gender pay gap reports, you'll have equal pay. And the two issues are very, very different. And every action plan or pay gap report that I review, I am always at pains to set out the fact that they are very different. I've undertaken so many audits of organisations that have completely transparent pay structures, very little discretion for managers, very little potential input in terms of any kind of discriminatory barriers, yet the pay gaps are significant in those organisations because of the fact that they struggle to recruit to certain roles, because of the gender composition of their workforce. So you can't understand an organisation's gender pay gap and whether that betrays any issues from an equal pay perspective without knowing that organisation. And that's why the action planning becomes important, because what's right for one organisation will absolutely not be right for another, which is why things like having annual targets in place and regular reviews may work for some, but they may not for others. Regular reviews, I would say, is great for everybody. Targets, that depends on what those targets relate to. Like I said, I think a target of reducing something by a specific percentage is probably something I would tend to shy away from, because I think that possibly unnecessarily puts undue pressure on how you're going to actually carry out your action planning. Reporting mechanisms are sensible, so that you have a regular report to the governing body on the progress on your action plans, and it also helps with that regular review phase as well. Very often some institutions will actually put in place a member of the governing body who will be responsible for those areas, so that there can be that link in on a regular basis. But also making sure that as you're reviewing matters, you are regularly reviewing your touch points. And this is where the life cycle approach, I think, is really useful, because once you're reviewing kind of all facets almost of the employment relationship, you can look at, well, actually we had an induction session last week. Do we actually think that we managed to sell our flexible working practices sufficiently there? How do we think that went down? Did we get any feedback from people who attended, etc.? So that's something that can be very useful. And making sure you're capturing your data effectively. That's something that is often an issue and often needs to be reviewed on a very regular basis as HR systems evolve, and coupled with now the ethnicity pay gap reporting that's going to be coming out next year. Having a look at actually what you have in terms of your data and how you'll be able to crunch that is really important. So effectively looking at that really carefully is a really top tip. But again, I come back to who owns the process, because it is critical to make sure that whoever is doing this has the ability and the time to be able to make sure that that's done effectively. But ultimately, these are living, breathing documents. You do need to let your plans evolve, and don't be scared to try things that don't work, because it may well be that something that somebody else has suggested works in one organisation doesn't necessarily work for yours. So it is a case of looking at and trying things, and that would be encouraged far more than being a bit scared of actually targeting the type of actions that we think would work for us. But ultimately, this is all part of a bigger picture. The gender pay gap reporting mechanism, in effect, it's a bit of a blunt tool, because we all know that when you're reporting on certain statistics, there's so many ways that you can cut the regulations because of the way that they're drafted, and there are so many ways in which the regulations themselves can be interpreted so that they are completely skewed. So, for example, very often you may have very good statistics up to a certain grade, and then it may well be that because of certain people at a higher level, that completely skews your gender pay gap statistics. And maybe that should be reflected in your action plan in terms of, well, actually, we don't think the problem is here. We think for our organisation, it's better that we're more specific in what we do in relation to that specific area. And that's fine. Learning from what others are doing and seeing what others are doing is really, really important. And looking at your targets in terms of your achievable goals. Recruitment data is a really good one, because that obviously tells you a story, as does exit interview information in relation to what they feel is happening on the ground. Training is one of those that some organisations are doing a lot, for example, of unconscious bias training at the moment. And from the research that I've been reading over the last few days, a lot of the researchers have been saying that they're not convinced that unconscious bias training necessarily is the panacea and is the answer to a lot of these. It may well be that actually it's something that helps, and obviously from a diversity perspective, it always helps to have that in place for your organisation. But that's something that you might want to look at. Flexible working, I think, given what's happening now, with COVID and the travel arrangements and the fact that we've all had to work flexibly over the last however many months, it's revolutionized the workplace, and it will revolutionize lots of people's lives who may not have been able to travel previously. So that would be the one area I would suggest to focus on action planning, is what are you going to do to make your workplace effectively fit for purpose for the future. And I'd suggest that probably should be very high up on everybody's action plans at the moment, in terms of the take up, but also what you're going to do to be a bit more proactive about that. Because, you know, in terms of women's responsibilities, sometimes men, obviously, but that is something that I think will have a dramatic effect on all workplaces in the future. And finally, just to touch base on positive action again. It is something that I am seeing more and more of, and I think it is something that more and more employers will be using as part of their action planning for all of the protected characteristics, bearing in mind what we've seen with the political dynamic this year with BLM. So it's something that I would say people have always treated with caution because of the potential discrimination risks, but I think it's something that you need to be alive to and consider at certain phases of your action plan. Always take legal advice on the steps that you intend to take in relation to positive action, because it's sensible to do that to make sure you're not doing something that may be indirectly discriminatory or that you haven't considered, but hopefully as part of your overall assessment processes, that's something that you'll be able to tie in quite nicely. And obviously you'll have your risk assessments that you'll be looking at in terms of whether the steps that you're taking are proportionate and necessary. But it is certainly something that you should all have pretty high on your agendas in terms of action planning for pay gap statistical purposes. So that's all from me. Does anybody have any questions? I haven't been looking in the chat function as we've been speaking, but I'm more than happy to take any questions on anything that we've discussed. Oh, I can see a question from Jenny. Have you done any work on encouraging people to declare their protected characteristics and creating an environment where they feel safe to do this? Yes, Jenny, absolutely. Funny enough, I'm doing a piece of work with a client at the moment in relation to that, because that is a real barrier, given that some people don't feel comfortable about providing that information. And what we're looking at doing there is, obviously in a virtual world, we're creating kind of safe, the data rooms behind the scenes, but we're asking people to kind of engage with us in a project. I can't tell you the name of the project, obviously, because it would be client sensitive, but a lot of that is about trying to provide information in a way that it's not stored on personnel files, and it's information that is gathered purely for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to enable us to look more roundly at the whole piece of, you've hit the nail on the head by saying it's about a safe environment, and making sure that from a psychological perspective, as much as anything, people are able to do that. And there's lots of work out there at the moment where organisations are doing a lot of that type of encouragement work. And actually, that's something one of my clients actually fed back to me, that working virtually has helped that. So that might be, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that might be something that you could think about maybe.
Sally, there's some more in the conversations, some more questions.
Are your graded pay structures still fit for purpose? The risks of having lots of pay increments in a grade, yeah. Well, that's the session that we're actually going to be doing later on in December. The risks of lots of pay increments in a grade means, clearly that you've potentially got age risks. You've also got questions over actually whether they're fit for purpose anymore, because of the fact that you may well be having people doing work of, equal work, but there's still very, very different pay. And very often it does tend to be, this is a generalization, but it is men who tend to have the longer service because of career breaks, etc. To what extent would you think unconscious bias of individual employees is the responsibility of the employer? Could employees argue their unconscious bias is structural? Potentially. I think that unconscious bias is a difficult one, because of the fact that very often it is unconscious, and I see employees trying to argue structural, endemic issues all of the time, but that's very, very difficult to prove. And I think if you're an employee, if you're an employer who is undertaking things like unconscious bias training, things like, you know, serious proper action planning in terms of where you consider issues, then obviously from a litigation perspective, you're going to be in a far better place to defend that than you would if actually you're not doing anything about it at all. But again, if you're saying you're going to do it, then do it, because that's the worst position, is saying you're going to do it and not. Who usually has responsibility for monitoring the action plan? It's normally somebody in HR. It would normally be somebody with diversity and equality experience. Some organisations have an officer who just deals in E&D, and they have responsibility over that. So it can be anybody who knows this area, or has even if they don't know the area well, have a passion for it and are prepared to actually work through it. And it's only going to be effective if that's the driver. Effectively, you need somebody who's going to do that and have senior backing to do it. No problem. Oh, good. Thank you, Nadine. I'm pleased you found it useful. It's one of those talks where there are so many things that you can put in your action plans, but sharing is everything. You know, knowing what others are doing. But again, you go back to the main point in all of this, which is really all about knowing your organisation. It is one part of that.
Okay, on behalf of ECC, I'd like to thank Sally for agreeing to facilitate this network group for us. It's been a really, really interesting session, Sally.
Good.
So thank you very, very much. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everybody.